presentation. Then we did self-planet, the connection between the self and the planet and how we can heal the collective wounds that we have right now. On Monday, yesterday, we did transformative technologies, the impact of technologies into everything we do. And today we are focusing on governance, economy, and public policy. So amazing week, so much, more than 100 sessions. But honestly, having you here is what I like the most.
It's always nice to see your face and hear your voice.
So, okay, so basically the session today, my ask is, we have the new Worldhappiness report. Can we talk about the highlights? What have we learned with this report? And we have about 20 minutes. So whatever you say, okay, this is what you cannot miss, this is what we need today.
We ended up, you've heard about the report as a whole, so we go into various parts of life in it. Perhaps better for you and me to talk about what's in chapter 2,
okay.
Which we have entitled Happiness, Trust, and Deaths under COVID-19. And that essentially covers the 3 major threads of our analysis this year. Because, first of all, as you can guess, we were surprised at how resilient the findings were from around the world. And then we asked ourselves, what among the supports for happiness were most important in helping people deal with COVID in 2 respects? Of course, managing their own lives while subject to whatever COVID experience they were having in their country. And secondly, perhaps more importantly, which of the things that support happiness helped countries to find the right resolution to the COVID crisis. And the second part of our report, it's entirely new for the Worldhappiness report, of course, because COVID is entirely new for the world. We had 3 chapters devoted to explaining the policy choices that countries had and what they did and how it worked out. And the evidence is absolutely startling, that there was only one way, and it was obvious as early as March, to deal with COVID, which is to drive community transmission to 0 and keep it there. Yeah. Because when you do that, then you can have sufficient testing and tracking and tracing. So when subsequent waves threaten, you can corral them and deal with them very locally. And so, of course, the leading countries in that effort were the SARS countries, countries that had previous pandemic experience in East Asia. But Australia and New Zealand quite quickly got this message and applied it. In the North Atlantic countries, essentially the message wasn't there, and it's the same in Latin America as well. So either I don't think, even in those countries, and there are many of them, fortunately, that said this is not a political situation. This is a scientific situation. We will follow the advice of our scientific advisors. And in fact, you found the national briefings and regional briefings being led by the chief health officers, with the premiers and the prime ministers standing in the wings. But of course, for that to work, you have to have the right scientific advice. Yes. And unfortunately, the wisdom of the East in this context did not get transmitted fast enough for most countries. So many of them found themselves thinking they could have a compromise of keep the rates low enough so that their hospitals are not being overrun, and then open things up again. Well, of course, in all cases that failed, because they simply did not understand 2 key things early enough, 2 key things about the virus, that it's transmitted through aerosols, in other words, the air, not just big droplets, and that it's transmitted by asymptomatic carriers. There's only one way of dealing with that, which is to suppress the virus completely. So the countries that did hardly started vaccinations because they don't need them. And of course, they've saved millions of lives, but certainly many hundreds of thousands of lives in doing so. So how does this all get into the happiness report? Well, of course, we wanted to know what made it better for easier for countries to find that solution. And as you might guess, one of the key variables that is big support for happiness and has also made it much more likely that countries chose a good COVID response was trust in public institutions.
Yes.
Also trust in each other. And we go even further than that, and we say benevolence is even more important. So this feeling that you not only trust others, but you want to help them, extraordinarily important in supporting life. And it turned out to be important in explaining which countries adopted the right solution. And so that ties the two parts of the report together. The countries that did best didn't have a huge happiness bonus in this year's surveys. My guess is when the surveys are done in 2022, you'll find much more pride and satisfaction in the countries that got it right, because at this stage, it's pretty apparent to everybody that the countries who got it right have 2021 deaths that are essentially zero, because after the first wave, they never had any to speak of. While the countries that didn't get it right, many of them have had almost as many deaths this far into 2021 as half of 2020. So quite clearly, they're still very much suffering. And of course, well, enough on that for the moment. This is, after all, a happiness report, but there are tight links between those two.
Yes.
Within one final footnote on that, it isn't just a cross-cultural difference. If we look within Western Europe, where in general they have had not handled the virus very well, the highlights are the Nordic countries. So we then took of the top 7 countries in happiness, 5 of them are Nordic countries. One of them, Sweden, got the science wrong. They simply said, we're going to have a very light touch and work our way through it. The other 3, to varying extents, essentially followed the epidemiology. What is now, I think, the epidemiologically approved and correct version of driving community transmission to zero and keeping it there. So the other 4 Nordic countries have very low death rates, both direct and indirect, while Sweden is not right up with the rest of the European countries.
So the through line for this week is being suffering. And we both know the importance and the relationship between happiness and suffering. Something that is quite remarkable for humanity is that probably over the last 12 months and now, we all are suffering almost a lot, I would say. Then people take it in a different way. So it's actually the way you deal with suffering that makes the difference. You talk about trust. You talk about benevolence. Something that we found through this week is the concept of belonging. So can we talk a bit more about trust and belonging? What are we finding when we go deeper into the data of the World Happiness Report?
Good question. As you may know, this year we had the benefit of a world risk survey run by the Lloyd's Register Foundation as part of an extra round of the Gallup poll in 2019. And they were talking about bad things happening, risks of the normal sort, and we convinced them to put in a measure of positive risk.
Nice.
What about the chance of good things happening? Those are risks, right?
Of course.
But they're the kind of risks like winning a lottery that you should. Why are we always talking about risk as though it's got to be something bad that's happening? You said, let's put in something good. And let's put it in a very special way. Let's put it in asked on exactly the same scale as you're asking about the bad ones. So then we can go back and find out how important are bad things relative to determine your happiness relative to good things. So they had a list of 7 risks of their usual sort, and you answered very likely, somewhat likely, and not at all likely for, are you likely to be subject to harm, personal harm from mental illness, from mental illness was one, and physical violence was another. And those were the two most important of those in terms of their effects on happiness. And then the positive risk was, imagine if you dropped your wallet. How likely is it to be returned if found by a police officer, on one hand, a neighbor, or a stranger? And so we separated the police from the neighbors and strangers because one's more institutional and the other is more personal and social. And we found both were enormously important. So to think your wallet is very likely to be returned raises your life evaluation by a full point on the 10-point scale. Now, the effect of unemployment is less than half a point. The effect of highly likely mental illness, less than half a point. The likelihood of personal harm from violence, less than about a quarter of a point. The prospect of benevolence being around you, and that implies belonging, right? Because we've asked this question. There's some history to this question, as you may know.
Of course, yes.
Reader's Digest dropped wallets in 10 cities around the world about 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. And we developed this survey question in order to have a survey that matched reality. So then we could say whether, in fact, we get good evidence from this or not. And way back 20 years ago, our top country, Finland, Helsinki was the only city where all 10 wallets were returned with the money intact.
Wow.
So already they had that benevolence and sense of belonging, people looking after each other, that was so important. And we find, of course, the countries that rank best on happiness are those where there's that kind of benevolence and belonging, because it's not just belonging, it's belonging with a very positive twist to it. And so we were not surprised to find that it was so powerful. But this is the most powerful evidence you could have, that you could imagine. You've been in this game for a while. People are going to say, oh, people just answer that. There's no reality to it. It makes them feel better, but they still may not get their wallets back. So fortunately, there was a survey run by a team of researchers, an international team, that dropped wallets in 40 countries in big numbers. And the article was in Science last year. So we had their results for 39 countries that we had our Gallup World Poll data for, and the correlation is very high. So in those countries where people think, and it makes them happy to think their wallet would be returned, but they're right. Their wallet, in fact, would be returned.
Yes.
And so it's not just pie in the sky, it's benevolence seen and appreciated. And of course, it was very effective in both supporting people under harm and in helping them to develop strategies that have avoided harm. And the fact that they were so important relative to the negative things gets back to your point, that the positives ended up being more important, that they did have, could cherish, and could bring to play, were more important than the negatives they were suffering.
That's so interesting. And this is something that, well, probably you know, but I work in the consulting at Deloitte for 12 years, and risk was always the word. But I play with the risk, and then I included the risk to reputation. So when you have risk to reputation, what do you do? So actually that brings you into the positive space, because then how do you increase your reputation? How do you go into the space where you can actually focus on your strengths, not just your weaknesses? But I feel that we are still driven in the world by a lot of fear and by a lot of hate combined. And this is a big deal. But can I ask you about, in this case, the combination of COVID and loneliness? Because we knew before COVID that loneliness was a big pandemic. Now, I feel that COVID has accelerated in many ways what is going to be a wave of mental health issues, and loneliness is going to stay there. So are we measuring what is the sense? What is your perception about how is this going to evolve? How loneliness is going to be actually probably the 21st century a big deal for the humanity?
Well, we're going to make it a small deal because
yes,
the conversation we've just been having about risk, we'll now have about friends. I was panelist in Canada's National Public Health Conference just before COVID, 6 months before COVID, and I was a keynote speaker on their panel on loneliness, the new pandemic, and this was the big public health issue. And I said, you've got the wrong name. And in fact, there are some countries that have ministers of loneliness. And I said, you don't want to wait until someone's lonely and cure it. What you want for loneliness is a vaccine to prevent loneliness. You don't wait until someone's lonely. You don't only think about loneliness when you find lonely people. That's a little bit like waiting till someone's depressed before you ask whether the environment in which they're living is a happy environment. And of course, the vaccination for loneliness is a friend. And if we thought about our healthcare system differently, if we thought about our public services differently, thought about our neighborhoods differently, we'd be providing vaccinations against loneliness with all our interactions. Because the daily interactions are the stuff and nature of it. It goes into healthcare, where general practitioners should be asking and offering what are now called social prescribing. But I said, you're waiting too long. You don't wait until someone comes in and is diagnosed as lonely and then you give them a friend. You give them the friend first.
Exactly.
So you should be designing all our health maintenance structures with an eye to saying, that aspirin a day we take for your heart, you have to encourage you to have positive social interactions every day to be good for your soul.
Exactly.
And your heart and your head. And so it's taking medicine and taking it broader and happier. It shouldn't be about, we call it in epidemiology, we call it positive epidemiology. And I've written a paper with just that title,
Beautiful.
Towards a Positive Epidemiology, that we should be studying the circumstances under which happiness flourishes. And of course, if you do that and do it right and do it early, you never get loneliness. Doesn't appear. You don't wait until something becomes a problem, then you give it a ministry, then you give it a pandemic status, and that's not the way to deal with it. What we're talking about is friendship.
Exactly.
Let's have a ministry of friendship, but of course every ministry should be the ministry of friendship.
Yes.
That's the whole point.
It's amazing, John, how somehow we humans got it a bit wrong sometimes, but thanks to people like you, and wisdom lies like the one you have, I'm always optimistic that this is going to go in the right direction. We have 4 minutes. Can you share with us if there is any major changes in the ranking of the World Happiness Report? We know that Finland is again number one, but have you seen any major changes in this edition?
In terms of shares of the world population, there are two countries that had significant moves and are very large countries. One is China and the other is India. And there was a bit of a mode change as to how we collected the evidence. But my guess is that'll carry on next year as well. And you can see why, in a way, they probably have some pride in having dealt with it and helped other countries to deal with it, even if they were, unfortunately, where it started. The other is India, where there'd been a long slide, as you know, and India had, in the last report, had actually been down in the bottom 10 countries, having come from significantly higher. There's been a sharp reversal in India of that downward slide. We haven't yet unpacked it to find out where it comes from. But of course, if you've got, way above 1 billion people being significantly happier than for the world, that's an important thing. It takes our population weighted averages, which we're going to be going back to talk about next year. And that's a real boost for them if you can get large swaths of the world population more happy.
Well, John, it's always an amazing pleasure having you and learning from you. We are going to be promoting through the months ahead every chapter of the Worldhappiness report so people can get access to the deepness of what's there. But I want to thank you because what you are doing and the way you are leading this space is remarkable. So I really, really want to thank you for being here, for all what you do.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.